Hey, hope everyone is doing well. Today I wanted to do a sort of response video to something I watched a few weeks ago because I found it very interesting and was hoping to expand on the conversation even further. As stated in the title of this video, of course, the video in reference here is quote-unquote, How Halo 2 Critiques Religion by the channel Meaning in Between. First off, I just want to get it out of the way. There is no correct answer, so to speak, about what Halo 2 is saying, obviously. I mean, the beauty of art and the meaning are very much in the eye of the beholder. And granted, there's no correct answer. As I just said, both him and I do seem to agree there are certainly incorrect answers. In this case being we both agree that Halo 2 is certainly not inherently anti-theist in its message. Go watch his video before this one if you haven't already. There he explains with pretty substantial evidence. In addition to what he said, I also pointed out in my previous video about Halo 2 and religious institutions, that video is linked in the description, that in order for this game's message to be inherently anti-theist, the beliefs of the Covenant would be shown to be not even metaphorically true. But as I said then, is it really so inaccurate to describe these massive, highly advanced ring worlds, the Halo rings themselves, as sacred? Given their vast knowledge of things no other species in the galaxy has records of, is it completely inaccurate to describe the monitors as sort of oracles in their own right? Secondly, I cannot emphasize enough, this is not some takedown or debunking type of hostile video. This is me getting incredibly inspired, actually, by the analysis of a fellow Halo fan, and hopefully contributing to the conversation in a meaningful way using my own perspective as a guide. Lastly, if you've had thoughts that neither of us have stated in our videos, then I highly encourage you to hop over to his video, or my own, or ideally both, and share in the comments. Conversations on a deep level like this about games are just always better with more participants, so please get in there. And without further delay, let's get into the first segment of the video that I think I actually have something interesting to say about.
Held to destroy it. But when Halo 2 decided to open up our eyes to the Covenant at ground zero and get us to empathize with their hero, the Arbiter, they were in for quite a narrative challenge. How do you flesh out a two-dimensional archetype without destroying your narrative structure?
I, as a writer, really appreciate how he acknowledges the challenge facing the writing team of Halo 2. And he's right that part of the strength of the game's writing is that it wasn't trying to match CE, but rather went in its own direction. Even when it comes to non-professional storytelling, like with my D&D groups, I often find myself making a mostly brand new world from scratch easier as a follow-up campaign to a group that just finished a previous campaign, rather than, say, trying to write a sequel or prequel in the same setting they just finished in. Despite the fact that it obviously and arguably requires more total work from me to do than just expanding the world that was already there. I mean, in my and many other writers' opinions, making brand new stories are a lot easier than sequels, and history has shown that to be, more often than not, very accurate, actually.
If a religious narrative believed fundamentally on blind faith led someone to commit genocide, then who's the real perpetrator? The man or the idea? This allows.
If you see my previous video on Halo 2 and religious institutions, you'll recall how my main thesis was basically how I view Halo 2 as an anti-authoritarian critique of religious hierarchies. So when he says who's to blame, the man or the idea, for the Covenant's crimes against humanity, I personally am seeing it as neither the Covenant's religion nor like the Arbiter per se being the primary culprits, but rather the prophets themselves, their unchecked power and greed. I mean, there's a reason why we all felt the most relief that the Covenant's genocidal campaign against humanity was defeated when it was the death of the Prophet of Truth when he was killed by the Arbiter. Not when the Arbiter switched sides, nor when the elites started to break away from the Covenant's dogma, which sure gave us all more hope, but surely it did not provide the amount of relief and security that the death of Prophet of Truth did for us when we were playing through that. And I think it's because subconsciously we can all recognize that the prophets were the driving force behind the entire war. And also, skipping ahead, I'm not going to play the entire video here. I don't want to do that type of video really, so go watch his stuff if you're curious. But also, I am just a big fan of him explaining the history behind halos as religious symbols and how that obviously is going to translate into meaning for this franchise that's literally titled Halo. I'll also add here, I imagine, and I'm not certain, but I would guess that part of the reason or meaning behind this first painting in Iran back in 300 BC that showed what we would call a halo today, it likely probably has some ties with the strong presence of Zoroastrian culture, which has been throughout Iranian history for goodness knows how many thousands of years.
Exemplified in the prophet of regret when he hears directly from his oracle that the Covenant's belief in Halo is false and that the ring, in reality, is intended to be a weapon.
Actually, based on Halo lore written during Bungie's tenure over the franchise, this isn't the first time the prophets have been confronted with the fact that their narrative is false. As seen in Contact Harvest, written by Joe Staten himself, the prophets spoke to a part of Mendicant Bias, and he explicitly told them the humans were the Forerunners' chosen reclaimers of all they left behind. The prophets themselves aren't waging this war based on genuine religious beliefs, but rather explicitly because the truth threatens their power. Regret already knew the Covenant mythos was false long before being confronted with the fact Halo is a weapon. I view this scene as less of a critique of the Covenant's faith, but rather breaking down the Prophet's lies in front of Arbion the Chief, with obviously the Chief recognizing it and the Arbiter being far more hesitant.
The Bible. Thinking back on Halo 2, it's the same unwillingness to accept alternatives that leads to the violence and destruction of the Covenant, eventually resulting in their own great schism and eventual demise. We see this very...
I don't think that the lack of accepting other religious views is what necessarily caused the Great Schism. Granted, I'm not saying that the prophets were religiously tolerant, that's not what I'm saying, but rather, the elites didn't change their faith when demoted. No, the Prophet of Truth made an explicit power play to cement his position further, eventually culminating in him ordering the elites to be hunted down. Truth chose Tartarus over the Arbiter because he viewed the brutes as less of a threat to his rule. I mean, after all the prophets had put him through, the Arbiter never once betrayed the Covenant or dropped his faith in the prophets until his own fellow elites were being slaughtered in front of his own very eyes. In other words, I think it was a lack of acceptance to share power more so than accepting other religious views. I mean, remember with the Covenant founding myth that it was a bond between the prophets and the elites, that the elites would always be their protectors and they would always be the sort of religious leaders. And getting rid of them would secure the prophets' power because the brutes do not have such a precedent to share a quote-unquote equal role. And so, also, given the fact that Arbiter on a religious level believed in them up until very, very late after being betrayed and stabbed in the back by them metaphorically and sometimes literally several times, it's demonstrating that the prophets have no issue betraying those who fully believe in them if they believe it will secure their power. So yeah, I don't necessarily view it as being the lack of acceptance of other religious views that's at the core of this, but again, it's not like I'm trying to come out here and say that the Covenant is suddenly religiously accepting. That's not what I'm saying.
Quite possibly something called a solar halo, which is actually a real phenomenon caused by the sun refracting through ice to create a giant halo with a cross at the center of it. And this is interesting because it's just like the brilliant halo the Covenant saw in the sky, which led them to fight in its honor and ironically kill in the name of the ones who didn't kill, but instead sacrifice themselves to save the galaxy. You can see the irony in both cases to take up arms in the name of a non-violent creator. Of course, the Forerunners weren't complete pacifists, but they did sacrifice themselves just as Jesus sacrificed himself to defeat the sin that would consume the world, or the flood that would consume the galaxy. And in Matthew 25:52, Jesus even explicitly says, "Put your sword back in its place. For all who draw the sword will die by the sword." It's in light of statements like these where we can see the extreme perversion of something like Constantine's men taking the symbol of Jesus' sacrifice and crudely adorning it to their weapons, meant to slaughter their enemies instead of love them. You can see the similarity here.
I know this may come off to some as a bit nitpicky at first, but just hear me out. I don't think this metaphor works due to a few key flaws. The Halo rings are super weapons, and they were used as such by the Forerunners, for one. Also, even though they did save the galaxy from the flood, I wouldn't necessarily call them symbols of sacrifice or anything in that type of way. Firing the rings led to the extinction of all non-categorized species, after all. Keep in mind, this isn't a Noah's Ark situation where all the species were saved and came back. Oh, and also I would argue that the precursors fit the role of our non-violent creator, as he says, better than the Forerunners, who, keep in mind, committed genocide against the precursors, leading to the formation of the flood in the first place, pardon me. So yeah, in my eyes, the metaphor here just has a few too many holes for me to agree with it. Kind of unrelated, but I do at least very much enjoy how candid he is with the delivery of it. You can tell it's coming from the heart and all that, which is always super fucking cool.
Stood about the law. Unlike the heretics, who are blinded by the rage of being deceived and, as such, are consumed by the flood, we must, quote, know the rules well so we can begin to break them effectively, end quote.
Interesting. I never viewed the heretics as being blinded by anger, thus why they were defeated. Rather, I always saw them being put in a desperate situation by a much larger and genocidal power. In fact, if you think about it, the unleashing of the Flood in a desperate last-ditch effort in a hopeless situation kinda resembles the Forerunners to me. And in fact, when I think about it, their situation resembles the Forerunners to me more so than the Forerunners fit any definitions of creators being creators themselves, so I don't think I'd ever have viewed it that way. So that's an interesting perspective. Cool.
This is what makes the Arbiter and the rest of the elites so compelling. Again, much in the same way the Apostle Paul works through similar convictions in the book of Romans, the elites are the ones who see the evils they have done, the wicked men they have been, and then they work to expand their mind, repent, and correct this. It's the brutes that represent those fundamentalists that delude themselves in the name of conviction and loyalty to their faith, which is why they must replace the elites in the high covenant position, just as the sword will often replace the love in religion if fundamentalist wins out above all else, in religion, ideology, or society at large. This is what happens.
While yes, both the brutes and the elites fit this framing perfectly, I must add, I don't think it's a coincidence that the elites don't rebel until long after they have been replaced by the brutes. In other words, I believe that their demotion was the primary catalyst that helps them eventually see the prophet's lies and ally with humanity in the end. But yeah, I love videos like this. People from such a plethora of experiences enjoying and finding meaning in the same game is one of the biggest things that got me into the gaming industry in the first place. And yeah, that's all I really have to add to it. I'll have both Meaning in Between's video as well as my previous video on Halo 2 and religious institutions in the description. There you can find the channel's Twitter, as well as the PayPal should you wish to financially support the channel. And lastly, my business email should you wish to hire me as a contract writer will also be there. Love you all and have a good one.